The last bucket of earth came up heavy, scraping against the tight clay walls of the narrow shaft with a sound that felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Kora Hale pulled the rope hand over hand, her arms shaking from weeks of the same motion. Sweat ran down her back and soaked into the waistband of her skirt. The August heat above the barn pressed down like a weight from the sky, but down in the hole there was only cool air and the deep smell of raw earth. She dragged the bucket over the edge and tipped it onto the barn floor. The dirt spilled out in a thick, dull heap. Her knuckles were split and rough. Her palms were covered in hard skin, built from nights of digging by lantern light. She looked down into the dark space she had carved beneath the boards and felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. It was done, 10 feet deep and 8 feet across, the walls braced with heavy planks taken from the old shed her husband once planned to tear down. The floor lined with flat creek stones and covered with thick boards. The clay walls sealed smooth with white lime that dried hard as stone. It was not just a pit, it was a vault, a hidden stomach beneath the barn. Her husband Martin had been gone for 2 winters. Fever had taken him fast and left her alone on a stretch of Kansas prairie that did not forgive weakness. Before he died, he used to say, "The land gives, and the land takes." He said it like a rule that could not be broken. Kora believed the rule, but she did not believe in standing still while the land decided her fate. She remembered the winter of 1878, the long lines at the settlement store, the thin sacks of flour that ran out before everyone was served. She remembered the hollow look in the eyes of men who had worked hard and still had nothing left to feed their children. Faith did not fill a belly. Hard work and a plan did. When she bought extra seed corn that spring, people noticed. When she hauled more planks into the barn and reinforced the floor, they noticed that too. Mr. Davies from the eastern property leaned on his fence and watched her with a look that mixed pity with warning. "A woman alone has no need for surplus," he had told her. "Best to trust your neighbors. That is how we survive out here." Kora did not argue. She only nodded and kept working. The idea of the silo had not come all at once. It grew slowly during long nights when the wind scraped across the prairie and the cabin felt too quiet without Martin's steady breathing. She would lie awake and listen to the land. She listened to dry spells that stretched too long. She watched the corn silk turn pale when the rain failed. She remembered stories Martin told about locust swarms when he was a boy, clouds so thick they turned day into dusk. "The land remembers every debt," he once said, while staring at a field that had given them bounty one year and dust the next. Those words stayed with her. She started the digging under the excuse of cutting a new pit for waste. That was a chore no one questioned. But the hole kept going deeper than any pit needed to go. Each night she lit a single lantern in the barn. She dug until her back burned and her hands split open. She hauled the dirt out with a rope and bucket. She carried it to the dry creek bed after dark and spread it thin so no one would notice. When she hit the thick clay layer, the work turned brutal. The pickaxe struck with a dull crack each time. She traded 3 hens for that tool and used every ounce of strength she had to chip the clay away. She braced the walls as she descended, pressing each plank into place and testing it with her full weight. Moisture nearly broke her spirit. After one rare rain, she felt dampness creeping through the clay. If the grain rotted, all her work would be wasted. She sat on the edge of the pit one evening and stared into the dark, wondering if she had buried her own hope. The answer came from a trader named Finn who passed through twice a year. His face was worn by sun and long roads. He stopped for water and noticed the clay packed under her nails. He did not ask questions. He pulled a small sack from his pack. "Slaked lime," he said. "My grandfather lined his spring house with it. Keeps the damp out." She traded stitching on his torn sleeve for the sack. That night she mixed the white powder with water and spread it over the clay walls. The lime dried pale and hard, sealing the earth. When she ran her hand across it, she felt strength instead of fear. When harvest came that year, It was good. The corn stood tall. The wheat heads were heavy. While others filled their lofts and sheds, Kora worked in secret. Each night she threshed part of her crop inside the barn. Sack by sack she lowered grain into the darkness below the trapdoor. She never filled it all the way. She left enough in plain sight to avoid suspicion, but 3/4 of the silo filled with gold-colored grain. It rested there in cool silence beneath the boards. When she sealed the trapdoor and scattered hay over it, she felt something she had not felt since Martin died. Not joy, not comfort. Something stronger. Control. Let the winter come. Let the sky turn mean. She had carved out a place the land could not easily take. The next spring began soft and green. The community relaxed. Mr. Davies even smiled at her on the road and said the Lord provides. Kora only nodded. By July, the heat turned sharp and cruel. The sky grew pale and dry. The soil cracked. The corn leaves curled in distress. Then came a sound on the wind. At first, it was faint. A distant clicking hum. It grew louder each day, a dry rattling that made men stop in their fields and look west. Kora heard it and felt a cold thread of memory pull tight inside her chest. She sealed cracks in the barn boards. She drew extra water from the well. She gathered her chickens inside. The sound grew into a roar. One afternoon, the western sky darkened with a moving stain. It was not a storm cloud, it was alive. The locusts came like a living wall. They fell on the fields in a thick wave of wings and hunger. The green corn vanished in hours. The wheat disappeared. Trees were stripped bare. The air vibrated with the sound of chewing and wings beating. For 2 days, the swarm covered everything. The sun turned into a pale circle behind a moving mass of bodies. When they finally rose and drifted east, they left silence behind. Kora stepped out of her cabin and saw ruin. Fields reduced to stubble and dirt. Gardens erased. Hope chewed down to nothing. Neighbors stood in their destroyed fields with empty hands. Kora did not speak. She turned her eyes toward the barn. Beneath the floor, cool and untouched, her secret waited. The days after, the swarm felt hollow, as if the prairie itself had been scraped clean of sound and spirit. The wind moved across bare fields with nothing left to bend. The earth showed through everywhere, dull and exposed. What had been green and gold was now only brown and gray. Kora walked the edge of her ruined cornfield and did not allow herself to linger on what was gone. The stalks were chewed down to splinters. Even the fence posts were scarred where the locusts had clung in thick layers. She knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. It was dry and fine, like sifted ash. Across the fence line, Mr. Davies stood in the center of his land, with his hat hanging loose in his hand. He did not look at her. Pride still held his spine straight, but there was no strength behind it now. His barn loft was nearly empty. Everyone knew it. The first week passed in stunned silence. Families ate what little they had stored from the year before. Flour was measured carefully. Salt pork was sliced thin. Gardens that had been spared only in small patches were picked clean. Chickens were butchered sooner than planned. Men spoke of riding to the nearest rail town for supplies, but word traveled fast that the swarm had hit every settlement for miles. There was no outside help coming. Kora rationed from the grain she had left above ground. She ate sparingly. She fed her hens only enough to keep them laying. Every evening she checked the trapdoor in the barn. She ran her fingers along the seams, testing for drafts or signs of pests. The lime lining held firm. The air that drifted up from below was cool and dry. She did not open it. Not yet. By the 3rd week, the change in the community became clear. Faces thinned. Voices grew short. Friendly greetings faded into tight nods. Curtains stayed drawn longer in the mornings. Smoke from cook fires rose weaker and less often. Mrs. Reedig Davies came one afternoon with a lace collar wrapped in cloth. Her hands trembled as she held it out. "It belonged to my mother," she said softly. "For a dozen eggs." Kora studied the fine stitching. It was beautiful work. It meant more than eggs ever could. She handed over the eggs without comment and did not take the collar. Mrs. Davies looked both relieved and ashamed as she left. That night, Kora sat at her small table and opened the ledger Martin once used to track seed and livestock. She ran her finger down the blank pages. She knew what was coming. Hunger did not knock loudly at first. It crept in and made itself at home. The breaking point arrived at her door just before dusk. Samuel Turner stood on the porch, hat crushed in his hands. He was young, barely past boyhood, hired by the Davies family to help with planting and harvest. Now there was no harvest to help with. He did not meet her eyes. "I can chop wood," he said, "mend fences, clean stalls, anything." For a sack of flour. His voice cracked on the last word. Kora studied him. His cheeks were hollow. His collar hung loose around his neck. He was not asking for himself alone. "Mr. Davies will not come," Samuel added in a low voice. "He says a man should not beg, but Mrs. Davies has not eaten a full meal in days." They started grinding the seed corn meant for spring. That image struck hard. Seed corn was the future. To eat it was to accept defeat beyond winter. Kora felt the weight of the barn behind her. Beneath the boards, the grain waited in silent abundance. She did not answer right away. She thought of the weeks of digging, of split hands and lime plaster, of nights spent hauling dirt like a thief. She had built the silo for herself, for safety, for control. But a valley of starving neighbors would not leave her untouched. Desperate men made desperate choices. Hunger did not respect fences. "Wait here," she said at last. She walked to the barn with steady steps. Samuel followed at a distance, confused but hopeful. Inside, dust floated in thin shafts of fading light. The broken plowshare still lay across the faint outline of the trap door. She knelt and moved it aside. She scraped back hay and dirt. Her fingers found the hidden groove in the boards. The door lifted with a heavy breath of cool air. Samuel stepped closer and froze. Below them, in the lamplight she lowered down first, lay a mound of golden grain. Sack upon sack stacked neatly along the walls. The lime lining shone pale and clean. It looked unreal against the ruin outside. Samuel's mouth fell open, but no sound came. Kora descended the ladder slowly. She felt calm, not triumphant. She filled one large sack with wheat and tied it tight. When she climbed back up, she handed it to him. "This is not charity," she said firmly. "It is a loan. Every sack will be counted. Come spring, when planting begins again, it will be repaid in seed or labor." Samuel nodded quickly. Tears shone in his eyes, but he wiped them away. "Tell Mr. Davies I am calling a meeting at sunrise tomorrow. In this barn. Anyone who wants to eat this winter will be here." He gripped the sack and hurried off across the field. Kora replaced the trap door and covered it once more. Then she went inside and opened the ledger. On the first page, she wrote a single line: "Community Grain Bank." The next morning they came. Men and women stood inside her barn in uneasy silence. Pride and hunger mixed in their faces. Mr. Davies stood near the front, arms crossed, jaw tight. Kora stood beside the hidden door beneath their feet. She let the quiet stretch until every eye was on her. "There is enough," she began. "Enough for all of us to survive the winter if we are disciplined." A murmur moved through the crowd. "This is not a gift. It is a bank. Each family will receive a weekly ration based on mouths to feed. Every sack will be weighed. Every pound recorded. In spring, what you take will be repaid." "Why should you decide?" a man from the back called out. "Because I dug the hole," she answered. No one argued. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "The terms are fair," he said slowly. That was all the approval she needed. The first distribution began that afternoon. One by one, families stepped forward. Kora measured grain with steady hands. She wrote each amount in the ledger with careful strokes. The line moved slowly, but no one left empty-handed. By sunset, something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was no longer wild. It had structure now. Rules. Order. As the barn emptied, Kora stood alone beside the trap door. The weight beneath her feet felt different now. It was no longer just her secret. It was their survival. Winter came early that year. The first frost settled over the prairie before the leaves had fully fallen. It coated the stripped fields in a thin white layer that looked almost beautiful from a distance. Up close, it felt like a warning. Each week, the families gathered at Kora's barn. They stood in a quiet line, hats in hand, waiting for their names to be called. There were no wasted words. Hunger had trimmed conversation down to what was necessary. Inside the barn, Kora worked with steady hands. She lifted the trapdoor, descended the ladder, and filled the measured sacks herself. She weighed each one on the iron scale Martin once used for seed. She wrote every amount in the ledger. Samuel stood beside her most days, learning the routine. He carried sacks up from the ladder and handed them to waiting families. He did not speak unless spoken to. The weight of what lay beneath the floor kept him careful. The system brought order, but it also brought tension. Some men did not like standing in line before a woman. Some muttered that she held too much power. Others looked at the trap door with something close to envy. Kora noticed everything. One afternoon, a man named Harold Boone stepped forward out of turn. He had 5 children and a temper that had grown short with the cold. "This is not enough," he said as she handed him his weekly share. "My boys are growing. They need more." "Everyone here needs more," Kora replied without raising her voice. "This is what the ledger allows." Boone's jaw tightened. He looked at the door beneath her boots. "You could give a little extra and no one would know." Kora closed the ledger slowly. "I would know." The barn grew silent. Boone held her gaze for a long moment, then took the sack and stepped aside. The line resumed. Trust was thin that winter, not because Kora was unfair, but because hunger made people suspicious. Every ration felt like life measured in pounds. Snow came heavy in December. It drifted high against the barn walls and sealed the world in white. Travel between homesteads slowed. Families stayed inside longer. Smoke from chimneys rose in thin gray lines against the pale sky. Inside her cabin, Kora allowed herself only what she had allotted to others. She did not take more. The ledger was law, and she obeyed it as strictly as anyone. One night, after a long day of distribution, she heard boots crunch outside her barn long after dark. She sat upright in bed and listened. The sound came again. Slow steps. Then the faint scrape of wood against wood. Kora rose quietly and took the lantern. She did not grab a weapon. Instead, she walked straight to the barn. Inside, she found Mr. Davies standing near the trap door, his breath fogged in the cold air. His face looked older than it had in summer. He did not move when she entered. "I could not sleep," he said finally. "Neither could I," she answered. He glanced at the floor beneath them. It is a heavy thing, being responsible for all this. It was not accusation. It was something closer to understanding. Kora set the lantern down. "It is heavier to watch neighbors starve." He nodded slowly. "You were right," he said after a moment. "About surplus. About planning." The words seemed to cost him. Kora did not smile. She did not gloat. "We were all wrong about something," she replied. "We thought the land would follow our wishes." A long silence filled the barn. Then Davies surprised her. "I have 2 strong oxen," he said. "If spring comes and the soil can be worked, I will plow every field in this valley if I must. Your debt will be repaid first." Kora studied him. For the first time, she saw not the proud neighbor who had doubted her, but a man trying to protect what remained of his dignity. "We will all repay together," she said. "Or none of us will." He tipped his hat and left. As winter deepened, sickness tried to follow hunger. Children developed coughs. Old men grew weak, but no one starved. Each week the grain mound shrank. The ladder reached farther down before her boots touched the top of the pile. Kora adjusted rations carefully. Just enough to sustain, not enough to waste. In February, a blizzard hit with brutal force. Wind tore at doors and rattled windows. Snow buried fences and drifted against cabins. For 2 days, no one could leave their homes. When the storm passed, Boone's barn roof had collapsed under the weight. His remaining livestock were trapped. Without being asked, men from 3 homesteads came together. They worked in freezing wind to clear the wreckage. Samuel organized them while Kora coordinated from her barn, assigning extra grain to the families who spent hours in the cold labor. It was the first time the grain was used as more than food. It became fuel for cooperation. The tension that had hung in the air since autumn began to thin. By late February, something else shifted. People no longer looked at Kora with suspicion. They looked at her with reliance. Children waved when she rode past. Women stopped by not just for rations, but to share news. Men offered repairs to her fences without being asked. The grain had fed their bodies. The structure had fed something else. Still, the silo was not endless. One evening, as Kora stood at the bottom of the ladder, she ran her hand over the remaining pile. It was less than half of what she had stored. Enough for perhaps 2 more months at current rations. Spring needed to come early. She climbed up and closed the trapdoor with a quiet breath. Above ground, the snow had begun to melt in thin, gray streaks. Patches of dark soil showed through like scars. But beneath that soil lay seeds that had not been eaten. Not in her barn. Not yet. And for the first time since the Locusts, she allowed herself to believe that the land might give again. March arrived with mud instead of mercy. The snow melted fast under a pale sun, turning the prairie into a wide stretch of wet earth and broken fences. Water pooled in low spots. Wagon wheels sank deep. The air smelled of thawing soil and rot. Kora stood at the edge of her field and watched the ground breathe again. Beneath the surface, life waited. But life needed seed, and seed had become the most precious thing in the valley. The grain bank continued through the final cold weeks. The pile in the silo had shrunk to a careful mound. Every descent down the ladder felt more serious now. She could see the stone floor in places where golden wheat once lay thick. The families were stronger than they had been in November. Faces had filled out. Children ran again instead of sitting quietly by the stove. But strength alone would not bring harvest. The land had to be planted. One evening she called another meeting in the barn. The neighbors gathered once more on the dusty floor. This time their eyes held less fear and more focus. They were not just surviving anymore. They were waiting. Kora opened the ledger and set it on a crate. "We have enough to reach planting," she said. "But if we eat what remains, we will have nothing to sow." A murmur moved through the crowd. Samuel stepped forward. "How much seed do we need?" he asked. Kora had already done the math. She had counted acres. She had measured hands and mouths. She had balanced survival against future yield. "Enough to plant every workable field," she answered. "But it means smaller rations starting today." There was no protest. Only nods. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "My oxen are ready," he said. "I will start plowing at first light. Any man who wants his field turned will line up behind mine." Others spoke up. Boone offered his remaining mule. 2 brothers from the northern edge offered tools. Women volunteered to sort seed and mend harnesses. For the first time since the Locusts came, the barn felt warm with something stronger than hunger. The next morning, the valley moved as one. Davies guided his oxen through the first dark rows of earth. The soil turned heavy and rich beneath the plow. Men followed with their own fields, some by hand, some with borrowed teams. Samuel ran messages between farms. Boone worked without complaint, his temper softened by winter hardship. Kora oversaw the seed distribution herself. "This grain is not for bread," she told each family. "It is for the ground. Guard it with your life." They did. Small sacks of wheat and corn were carried carefully across muddy fields. Children were warned not to spill a kernel. Women pressed seed into furrows with quiet reverence. Every handful placed into the soil carried a season of struggle behind it. The rations above ground grew thinner, soup stretched with water, bread sliced into narrow portions. But no one broke the rule. Then came the storm. Late April brought dark clouds from the west. Thunder rolled low across the open land. The first rain fell heavy and hard, soaking the fresh planted fields. For a moment, fear flickered. Too much rain could wash seed away. But the storm passed quickly, leaving deep moisture behind. Days later, thin green shoots pushed through the soil. The first time Kora saw the young wheat rising in straight lines, she felt her throat tighten. It was not just growth. It was proof. The valley changed again. Men who had once doubted her now stopped by to report progress. Women shared plans for preserving the next harvest. Children chased each other along the edges of fields that were no longer empty. The ledger in Kora's cabin filled with marks not just of debt, but of labor repaid. Davies plowed beyond his own land, turning fields for widows and older couples. Boone repaired fences he had once ignored. Samuel worked from dawn to dusk without being asked. The grain bank had created more than survival. It had built structure. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft orange, Kora returned to the barn alone. She opened the trap door and climbed down into the silo one last time before planting season ended. The pile was small now, enough for perhaps 2 more weeks of rations if needed. The stone floor showed clear beneath her boots. She ran her hand over the lime-lined wall. It was dry, solid, strong. Above her, faint voices carried from nearby fields. Laughter, the creak of wagons, the steady rhythm of life returning. She climbed back up and sealed the door. When she stepped outside, Mr. Davies was waiting by the fence. "The wheat is coming in thick," he said. "If the weather holds, we will have more than we did last year." Kora looked across the valley. Green rows stretched farther each day. "It will hold," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "When this harvest comes, the ledger will be cleared," he said. "But I think we should keep the bank." Kora considered the idea. "The land gives and the land takes," she said softly. "We cannot stop it from taking. But we can choose how we answer." Davies nodded. This time, when he tipped his hat, it felt different. As summer approached, the valley no longer felt like a place that had survived disaster. It felt like a place that had learned from it. But storms were not the only test that could come. And Kora knew that true strength was proven not when hunger ruled, but when abundance returned. Summer came in steady warmth, not the cruel blaze of the year before. The wheat thickened and turned from pale green to strong gold. Corn rose tall and straight, its leaves wide and proud. The valley that had once looked stripped and broken now shimmered with promise. People worked from dawn until the last light faded. There was no laziness in their labor. Every stalk felt like a second chance. Kora walked her fields with quiet steps. She checked the heads of wheat, rubbing them between her fingers to test their fullness. She listened to the wind move through the rows. It sounded different now. Not empty, not hollow. Harvest began early August. Scythes swung in careful rhythm. Bundles of wheat were tied and stacked. Children carried small loads, eager to help. Laughter drifted across the fields where silence had once ruled. When the first wagons rolled toward the barns heavy with grain, Kora stood by and watched without speaking. She did not need praise. The proof was already before her eyes. That evening, the valley gathered in her barn once more. Not for rations, not for rules, for accounting. The trap door was uncovered again, this time in full daylight. Neighbors leaned in as she opened it. The silo was nearly empty, only a thin layer of grain remaining against the stone floor. Samuel climbed down first and looked up with a grin. "We used it well," he said. One by one, families stepped forward with sacks from their fresh harvest. They lowered them into the silo carefully. Golden wheat poured down, covering the stone once more. The hollow space filled steadily, the sound of grain settling like a promise kept. Kora stood beside the ledger and called out names. Davies. He stepped forward with 2 large sacks. Paid in full, he said simply. Boone came next, his 5 sons carrying extra bundles. With interest, he added, setting down more than his share. The ledger marks were crossed out one by one. Lines of debt replaced with clean strokes of balance. By sunset, the silo was fuller than it had ever been. But something had changed. This time, it was not Kora's secret. It was the valley's safeguard. When the last sack was lowered, Kora closed the ledger and set it aside. She looked around at the faces gathered in the barn. They were stronger now. Weathered, but steady. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "We thought you were wrong," he said. "We thought you doubted us." Kora met his eyes. "I did not doubt you. I doubted the sky." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Davies continued. "We cannot control what comes from the horizon, but we can control what we build beneath our feet." "The bank stays," voices agreed. Samuel stepped forward again. "We should expand it," he said. "Build another chamber while the soil is dry. Not just for grain, for seed and tools too." Heads nodded. Kora felt a strange mix of pride and relief. The burden she had carried alone was no longer hers alone. The responsibility had spread, shared by many shoulders. That night, after the others had left, she remained in the barn. She moved the broken plowshare back over the trapdoor out of habit, then paused. Slowly, she set it aside. There was no need to hide it anymore. The silo was no longer a secret to protect her from neighbors. It was a foundation that bound them together. Outside, the fields glowed under the last light of day. The prairie stretched wide and open, as uncertain as ever. Storms would come again. Drought would return, perhaps even locusts. But now the valley was different. It had learned that survival was not just about hard hands and strong backs. It was about foresight, structure, discipline, and the courage to act before fear forced action. Kora stepped out of the barn and closed the door behind her. The wind moved gently through the standing corn. It no longer sounded like teeth preparing to bite. It sounded like breath. She looked across the land that had taken so much and given back again. This time, they were ready. If this story moved you, share it. Leave your thoughts below and follow for more emotional Wild West tales of strength and survival.